In all the chaos, the voice, the light of God shines amazingly bright. So this week and next week we're going to look at another kind of major character in the Old Testament. That's kind of where we've been this fall. And we're going to talk about Joseph, or next week we're going to talk about Judah, who was one of Joseph's brothers. But let me kind of do the Cliff Notes version of the Joseph story. And I encourage you to read Genesis 37 through 50, because I didn't think you wanted me to stand up here and read 37 through 50, 13 chapters. So I encourage you to go home and read that so you get the full flavor. But here's the flavor. The Cliff Note version of Joseph is the youngest of his brothers. And he's probably the latest to be born, probably to a different mother than his other brothers. And they're jealous of him because his father, Jacob, loves him more than all the others. And so they conspire to do something. First they wanted to kill him, but one of his brothers says, no, we probably shouldn't kill him. Let's do something else. And so what they do is they dig a pit. Now Joseph is a dreamer. He has a life plan. And all of a sudden they dig a pit and they throw him into the pit. So his life plan is already thwarted and he's young in life. A band of Ishmaelites come and pick Joseph up. They sell Joseph, their brother, into slavery. They go to Egypt. The Ishmaelites do. Joseph becomes a servant of the captain of the guard, Potiphar, in Egypt. But he has gifts and abilities. And even though life has given him lemons, he makes lemonade. And he has these gifts and abilities. He's a great manager. And he's a very discerning person. And so the captain of the guard sees this and puts him in charge of this house. But there's a problem. Potiphar's wife says Joseph is a good-looking dude. And she wants to seduce him. But he does not return her advances. And out of anger and embarrassment, she has him arrested and put in jail. So here's a guy with skills and ability. His life plan is beginning to work out, and once again it's thwarted again. So he's in jail, and the cupbearer of the king of the Pharaoh and the cook of the Pharaoh have become persona non grata to Pharaoh. He doesn't like what they're doing, so he sends them to serve the people in jail. And Joseph serves them and helps them. And they discover his great ability, but they also discover he has a gift of interpreting dreams. And they have two dreams, and he interprets them correctly. And then he says, and then when Pharaoh restores them back, he made a promise. They made a promise to him before they left back to Pharaoh's service. They said that when they go back to Pharaoh, after Joseph had asked them to do this, they said, we will tell Pharaoh about you so you can be restored. Well, they never did it. Pharaoh has a dream, and he can't interpret it. And they remember, conveniently, we know someone that can interpret dreams. And Joseph comes out and interprets Pharaoh's dreams, which is they're going to have 7 years of amazing crops and 7 years of an intense famine all over the area. And Pharaoh's amazed by Joseph's gifts of dream interpretation, so he puts him in charge of all of Egypt. And Joseph's skills and abilities to make lemonade out of lemons, he begins to prepare Egypt for the 7 years of great harvest and the 7 years of famine. 3 times his dream, his life plan has been thwarted. He eventually re-meets his brothers when they come from Canaan, because there is no food in Canaan, and Egypt's the only place that has food. And at first they don't recognize him. And he does some kind of vengeful things, not mean things, but he doesn't let them know who he is until the end. And finally, he lets them know who he is at the very end of the text. And if you'll go to the message there, the text, here's what he says as he interprets what's been happening. He says, don't feel badly about what you did to him. Don't blame yourselves for selling me. For he says, God was behind it. God sent me here ahead of you to save lives. A little bit later, 3, 4, 5 weeks later, they return back from Canaan to bring their father. And he again says to them, as he reveals himself to them, don't you see, you planned evil against me, but God used those same plans for my good. As you see all around you right now, life for many people. So what's the issue coming out of here? I think one of the lessons in here is those times in your and my life when our plan is going, man. Maybe it's your burning bush passion. Maybe it's your life plan, your family plan, and all of a sudden it gets thwarted and thrown out of direction. And whatever you had intended does not turn out. Maybe it's because of circumstances beyond your control. Maybe there's people that have thwarted your life plans, and it's frustrating and it's painful, and it makes you want to cry out sometimes, God, where are you? In those moments, those seasons, those experiences, when you've got that thing going on and it's been thwarted and it feels like a struggle, and then you're like Joseph sometimes. You get this moment of amazing clarity where in the middle of the darkness, a light begins to shine. In the middle of your struggle, you experience nothing but amazing grace. And you begin to discover, like Joseph did, that even though God was not on the outside, God was weaving good through your life, even when you didn't know it. What you meant for good, what you meant for harm, God turned into good. Or, remember, if God is not in the foreground, God is always weaving in the background. Now, what I like about Joseph's narrative, if you read this text, there is none of this in this narrative about Joseph's life. There's none of this. There's none of, God hardened the brothers' hearts and they sold him into slavery. That's not there. God caused the Ishmaelites to take Joseph into slavery and sell him in Egypt. It's not there. There's none of, and God caused Pharaoh to make Joseph his great manager. Or God caused the cupbearers to remember Joseph in prison. There is none of that we often see in other texts in the Old Testament. There's no God moved in this life and this happened like we're pawns in a great game. All you see in the mention of God in those 13 chapters is those 2 verses we saw. When Joseph becomes aware of God's hand weaving a good out of what first felt like pain and harm and destruction and frustration. If God is not in the forefront, then God is at work in the background. Who here does not know that kind of experience? If you're honest about your life, I can tell you an experience from my life. I am standing up here today because of God weaving in the background. I met Ellen in 1999. Her sister-in-law introduced us at a graduation party when I was pastor at the Wolcott United Methodist Church. We talked for maybe a minute, but never really kicked it off, never really connected, right? I didn't meet her again for 5 more years. In those 5 years, my life plan got thwarted. I left the ministry. I was struggling with some big issues. Felt like I had no more call to the ministry. And so I stepped out, and I'm working with kids in a school district. And then I get another job. And somewhere along the way, I had 2 significant relationships thanks to Match.com. Seriously. And both of them got close to something really big and long-term, but it didn't happen for a few reasons. Well, guess what? Match.com, Ellen winked at me, which is the match thing about that person shows interest in me. And I winked back, and we started talking, started dating, and then we fell in love. A new life plan. I even went to find out if I could get a guidance counselor degree at a local college, and I was rejected. Life plan thwarted again. And then we fell in love. We fell in love while I was working at an electrical supply store. And then God started to move into my heart again and recall me into ministry. And I stand up here because of that call, but because of God weaving behind the scenes in a way. Ellen didn't know when she fell in love with me that I was going to ask her to be a pastor's wife. Or to be a wife of a pastor. Imagine what that was like. Oh, Ellen. Hey, ever been a pastor's wife? Well, she said yes. To be married and what all that meant. You talk about life's plans being thwarted 4 times in 7 years, and yet God was weaving something I didn't see. I wouldn't be here without it. Now, how about your life? Do you have moments like that when you don't see it on the outside, but all of a sudden you become aware of it on the inside? Because that is how God works, my friends. We are in the midst of God creating a new world by recreating our souls, our hearts, and our minds. And it's a quiet grace so often, isn't it? But it's grace. It's undeserved merit given to us out of love. God takes our circumstances and weaves a good. And sometimes it takes time, because the truth is, Scripture is right, that our ways and God's ways are not the same. And most of the time I say, thank you, Lord. And other times God takes everything we got and weaves it into this powerful, life-giving mosaic. That is who God is. Will we let the dream work in us? Will we let God weave this amazing grace, not just for us, but for our community and our neighborhoods and our world? So how do we do that? Well, I think you pray. Now, I know that's the default answer. What do? You pray. That's what a pastor says all the time. But think about it. Prayer is an act of confession in some degree. It's realizing at some level, I need help. I can't do it by myself. I want to be a part of something bigger than me. And prayer is also helpful because oftentimes when we go through struggles, our focus is on the problems and the limited resources we have or we are to meet the problems. Prayer is getting in touch with the ones whose resources are unstoppable and infinite. It's setting our gaze higher, not on the problems, but on the possibilities with God. And the other thing that we need to do is remember. Remember the vision. Remember the story. Remember the feeling. Weave yourself a part of God's story. That's why I love church. That's why I love Sunday school. Because we're sharing the greatest story ever told. We're asking all of us to weave ourselves into God's story of giving life. And remembering that is so important. It's life-giving. Read this morning about Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a guy that lived during the exile of Israel. In the exile of Israel, they were overrun by the Babylonians and taken their best and brightest into captivity in Babylon, 800,000 more miles away. And they're in there for 70 years. And the lament of Israel is, who are we without our identity? We don't know who we are anymore. So Nehemiah gets this vision from God to go back to Jerusalem to help rebuild the walls, literally rebuild the city as a way of reclaiming their identity of God's people, to remember who they are. He gets permission from the king of Babylon to go back and rebuild the walls. And he goes back and he starts rebuilding it. And he's getting done. And all along the way there are opponents and enemies that are trying to find ways to keep the wall from being done because they see what it means. They pass rumors. Oh, Nehemiah's just doing it to build up his own ego. But the people who worked with Nehemiah knew better. They saw him as a humble man, more worried about honoring God than himself. And as they get close to finalizing the wall, they finally, in a fit of desperation, they say, Nehemiah, come off the wall and come meet with us a little while so we can kind of work this out and have a peaceful future. But Nehemiah sees the ruse. What they're trying to do is get him off the wall to meet with them so they can kill him. And what he says to them is great. He says, in the presence of the thwarting, he remembers and reclaims the vision God is working on his heart. He says, I'm doing a great work. I can't come down now. Now, when you feel your life being thwarted, when you feel someone picking at you in a way that feels like it's pulling you away from where God is calling you to do, when you feel yourselves in the presence of circumstances and instances and relationships that seem to be pulling you away from your vision from your passion, from your burning bush, then maybe that's what we ought to be saying in love. I am doing a great work. I can't come down now. All God's people said. Amen.